Day 148. Zeb woke at 4:30 and started a small fire to make some coffee. They slept in one of the classrooms adjacent to the fellowship hall on a couple of gym mats. On the table outside their room, Linda had placed a bag with 2 apples, 2 pieces of bread, and a cup with some honey in it. Also in the bag were 2 granola bars and a note that said, "I know you'll be leaving early before breakfast. Here's a little something to tide you over till later." She drew a smiley face on the note as well. They were gone at 5. Carl rode with Zeb to the trading post where Zeb would pick up the messages to deliver that day. Carl left him there and continued out of town in the other direction and up into the mountains. He was heading for the home of Bailey Bezio. Bailey lived in the hills on a modest homestead with his wife and 2 sons. His oldest son was 22, was from his first marriage, and he had a 4-year-old son with his current wife. He had known him for years. They had attended high school together. As Carl rode up the driveway, he looked at a sign over the gate. It read Bezio, and it was engraved in a piece of cedar. Next to the name was a square box with an X inside it, engraved into the wood as well. Carl noticed that there were fresh tire tracks on the driveway also, a single line track like a motorcycle would leave. He reached down and clicked off the safety on his .45 in his holster. He then unclipped the retention strap on the scabbard that held his AR-15. Sitting on his horse outside the house, he yelled in, "Anyone home? Bailey! Bailey Bezio!" Bailey's wife came to the door. "Carl Fairley, what brings you out here?" "I need to speak with your husband." She informed Carl that he was inside but didn't want to be bothered. Carl insisted, telling her it was important. "Now, Carl Fairley, we heard you were working with them soldiers. We don't want no trouble with you. Just leave us alone and go now." "Samantha, I'm not leaving without talking to Bailey." "Bailey, get out of here," he yelled. The door opened, and Bailey Bezio was there looking out at Carl. "Carl, I ain't done nothing wrong. You know me." "Can I come in and talk, Bailey?" Carl asked. Bailey nodded. The 2 men sat at the kitchen table drinking water from old mason jars. "Bailey, I'm going to come right out and ask you. Where were you yesterday late morning?" "Well, I was here all day. Ask Sam." "I picked up your rifle, Bailey. I got it with me." "My rifle? What rifle?" "Oh, you know, the 308 you always took hunting back in the day when we were in high school. It's got your brand on the stock." Bailey managed a nervous chuckle. "Oh, that rifle's long gone, Carl. Stolen years ago." "Is that right?" "You still got them old dirt bikes, Bailey?" "Yeah, I got 'em, but they ain't run in years." That's real strange, considering I followed the tracks from one all the way up the driveway." Bailey stared nervously at Carl for a long few seconds. "Carl, them soldiers, they're taking over everything. We did just fine here for months without 'em. Now they come and they want to bring all sorts of rules and regulations with 'em. It's all about control, Carl. You know how many times I've come within inches of losing this place over the last 5 years? Between taxes and regulations on everything we do, everything we sell and produce. It's not right, Carl. Since the EMP went off and the country went into chaos, the government was nowhere around. I could operate freely. I bring my products to market without their scrutiny, without their regulations, or brutal tax structures. I'm actually starting to get ahead. Then here they come, trying to bring us back under their thumbs. I won't have it, Carl, and I'm surprised you're working with them. Let me tell you something, Bailey. I also like to lack regulations, but unlike you, I provide a quality product. My operations are clean. My meat and produce is clean and fresh. That pork you traded Nelson's this past winter made their son Josh sick. You cut too many corners in production. People like you need to be regulated. But you know what? I'm willing to overlook all that, Bailey. But you shot 2 soldiers, and your crew tried to burn down the trading post. And they shot at my son, Bailey, at my son. I ain't gonna overlook that. And I was in that room they bombed. I'm taking you in, Bailey, Carl said as he stood up. Bailey reached behind the wood stove, grabbed a loaded .357. He cocked it and brought it up to point it at Carl. Carl kicked his chair over, sending him to the floor. The gun fell out of his hand and landed on the floor near him. He reached over and picked it up, once again leveled it at Carl. By this time, Carl had pulled his .45 from his holster, and he shot it at Bailey 3 times, hitting him in the chest and in the head. He kicked the revolver away from the body. Samantha came running out screaming, pounding her fists on Carl's chest. Carl asked her where the kids were. Anthony, the 4-year-old, was at a playgroup at a neighbor's. Jackson, the oldest, was dead, she said. Apparently, he was in the truck that attacked the trading post yesterday. He played football in high school, had a heck of an arm. He was selected to throw the Molotov cocktail into the window. Carl buried Bailey out back. He offered to help Samantha, but she told him to leave and never come back. Carl still had unanswered questions. Who were the other men from the attack yesterday? Were there more in the group out there somewhere planning another attack? He left as she asked. She most likely didn't have the answers, and if she did, she wasn't going to tell Carl. But this was not over. In town, across the tracks from the trading post, was the camp where the security details and advance workers for the railroad lived. In the last row sat 4 tents, which housed the newest railroad workers who arrived on the day the train first ran into town. In one of those tents, there was a large man in his 60s. He was gruff-looking, physically fit, but had a hard look about him. He wore a leather vest with patches on it that indicated he was part of a motorcycle club. He had a patch on his right breast that identified him as a 1%er, and a patch on his left breast that read Sergeant at Arms. On his right bicep was a tattoo of a skull wearing a red beret, surrounded by jump wings. Written above the skull was the word Airborne, and underneath it said Death from Above. He unpacked clothing from his duffel bag and laid them out on his cot and began to unroll them. Inside each one was a piece of an AR-15, which he quickly and efficiently assembled. Rolled up inside one of the pairs of jeans was a Sig Sauer 1911 semi-automatic .45 handgun. The men had been warned when they signed on to the work party that firearms were forbidden, that the military would be providing security details for their protection. This man wasn't interested in protection. He concealed the rifle under the mattress of his bunk and stuck the .45 into a shoulder holster he wore over his t-shirt. He put a black hoodie on over it and slipped his vest on over the hoodie. He walked out into the muddy row in front of the tents and walked toward the trading post. A young corporal at the front entrance to the post put a hand up to stop him and said authoritatively, "We have a no firearms policy inside the post, sir. Are you carrying any firearms?" Roger thought briefly to himself how easily he could kill this kid. 3 ways came instantly to mind, and none of them involved even pulling out the .45. "No, son," was all he said, as he pushed past him, not so much as even looking at him. Inside, he picked up a cloth bag filled with beef jerky and placed it on the counter. He asked the clerk if they had cigars. The clerk motioned over to the shelf off to the side and explained that all they had for smoking material was over there, just homegrown tobacco and rolling papers. Roger picked up a pouch of the tobacco and a sleeve of papers and set them on the counter as well. The clerk said, "That'll be 1 gram of silver, sir." Roger looked at him menacingly. He said, "Silver? I don't have any silver, son." The clerk asked what he did have to offer in trade. Roger explained that he was working for the railroad and just arrived in town and had not started working yet, and thusly had nothing to trade. The clerk told him that that wasn't a problem. He could set up an account for anyone working with the railroad, and if he just signed a voucher, it would automatically be deducted from his pay, since the post was hired as payment agent for the railroad. How convenient, Roger thought, and simply said, "That'll be fine, son." He leaned in, and in a quieted tone he asked, "You know where I can get a whiskey in this town?" The clerk looked around to make sure no one was listening, and said, "Well, alcohol is illegal, sir." "Says who?" Roger asked. "Major Stillman's orders." Then in an even quieter voice he said, "Go down to the end of the street where the metal fabricator's shop is. Go around back and there's an old warehouse with a wooden roll-up door. You'll see smoke coming from the chimney. Rap on the door 3 times, and when a man comes around, tell him I sent you. Name's Freddy." "They got whiskey?" Roger snapped. "Well," said Freddy, "they got corn mash, made locally." Roger turned and walked away. When he got to the warehouse, he rapped on the door, as instructed. A man walked around from the corner of the building and asked if he could help him. Roger told him Freddy had sent him, and as instructed, and he was interested in getting a drink. The man looked around suspiciously and said, "Follow me." He led Roger around a corner and down an alley to a small room connected to a large warehouse. It served as the boiler room for the building back in the day when there was a factory there. Once inside, they went around some debris and into another room that was much larger and set up like a bar. The man behind the bar said, "What's your pleasure, mister? You got corn mash or corn mash? Hey, I know. Why don't I pour you a corn mash?" He laughed, pleased with his attempt at humor. Roger drank the mash quickly, wincing as it went down. "That's awful," he declared, slamming the glass on the makeshift bar. "Give me another." After several shots, the bartender offered to pour another, and Roger told him he couldn't stand any more of that rot gut. He asked to see the man who ran the place. The bartender said, "You're looking at him." Roger stared for a second and chuckled. "No, really," he said. "Introduce me to your boss." The bartender, obviously insulted, looked up onto a mezzanine in the opposite corner of the room, just for a second, and looked back at Roger. Roger caught it, though, and turned and looked up there as well. There was a room with a mirror, and Roger figured that was the boss's office. Roger wasn't much for playing games. His instinct and impulse were to simply storm up there and see who was running the show. He stopped himself, though, and took a breath. "Young man," he said, "it's imperative I speak to whoever's in charge here. It's a business matter." The bartender looked up again. This time another, larger, more foreboding man appeared from the side room and asked Roger what his business was. How tedious this is, Roger thought. But then again, given the current state of things, I guess I can't blame the man for being cautious. He told the larger man, "I represent a group from out of town. We manufacture liquor products." He looked at the bottle his drinks were being poured from and added, "Top shelf liquor products." The man instructed Roger to follow him into the back room. There they were joined shortly by another man. He claimed to be in charge, and he and Roger discussed the matter at hand. In a short time they shook hands, having struck a deal, and Roger exited back into the street. He was no stranger to armed conflict, feared nothing. He served in the U.S. Army Special Forces as a Green Beret and spent most of his 5 tours in Vietnam in the super-secret MACV SOG, the Military Assistance Command Vietnam Study and Observations Group, also known as Special Operations Group, which ran classified cross-border operations into Laos, Cambodia, and North Vietnam. He served with a recon unit operating out of Kon Tum. where they carried out some of the most dangerous missions ever conducted by the U.S. military. Roger was wounded there in battle and, as a result, had become addicted to morphine. When having morphine administered during the chaos of battle, the medic would pin the spent ampule to the wounded soldier's collar in an attempt to avoid confusion. In this way, if another medic came across the soldier, he would know that he had received the morphine shot so that they didn't accidentally overdose him. In agonizing pain, soldiers would discard the spent ampules and call again for a medic who would then unknowingly administer more morphine. In the hospital afterwards, Roger had done all he could to continue on the drug, becoming dependent on it and ultimately addicted. When he was processed out for the wounds he received, the military questioned him, as they did all soldiers during out-processing. They received a form, and on it there were a list of questions. And one was, "Are you currently or have you been previously addicted to narcotic medications?" He checked the box, indicating the negative. The military knew that a great number of soldiers being out-processed were addicted to drugs of some kind. They didn't want to know. By simply asking and not challenging the answers, the military could effectively wash their hands of any responsibility to these young soldiers, essentially leaving them to go home and struggle on their own to overcome their physical and psychological issues. Some men spent an entire lifetime trying to accomplish that. Many died trying, still, decades later. Roger was now part of the leadership for a club of bikers who deal in illegal drugs, weapons, just about anything else that affords them with an opportunity for a higher than average profit margin. He had overcome his physical addiction to morphine years ago, but still woke randomly in the middle of the night with fits of horror. He would sit up in bed, sweating cold sweats, shaking profusely. The drug had helped him deal with those episodes, but not overcome them. It had been more than 15 years since he used morphine to temporarily quell the symptoms of the post-traumatic stress disorder from which he suffered. In his youth, just returned home from the war, he took his pay that had accumulated during his stay in the various hospitals, recovering from his injuries, and he bought a brand new Harley-Davidson FLHS. He had the insignia of the 101st Airborne Division painted on the rear right saddlebag lid. He was reckless and dangerous. It didn't take long for him to draw the attention of a local motorcycle club. He prospected with them almost immediately. He accepted any job they gave him and carried it out with the precision and attention to detail any great airborne ranger would. He quickly rose through the ranks to his current position of sergeant at arms. He was third in command after the president and vice president, who were both members when he was recruited, and who were both also in their late 60s. During this time, in a post-EMP world, they made a good living, largely from the manufacture and sale of contraband alcohol. Alcohol was banned in many areas under martial law. Roger and his cohorts would simply steal liquor from anyone who had any of the remaining quality stuff left over from the pre-EMP world and sell or barter it. They also ran a distillery where they made quality whiskey and sold or bartered that as well. Their preference was silver, but they would barter for almost anything of value, which they would then in turn sell for silver somewhere else. They had a vast network of various types of people all up and down the valley, which had been established long ago during their drug and gun running days. Roger was a point man for the club's operation and often advanced alone. He drew less suspicion, and it allowed him to come and go more freely this way. In passing, he appeared to be merely an older man trying to work and survive in this new society. In reality, he was a seasoned killer, and someone not to be messed with. As he walked down the street back toward the camp where he was now living, and posing as a railroad worker, he stopped and sat on a bench on the train platform. He rolled a cigarette out of the tobacco he got on credit at the post earlier. He sat and smoked and watched the activity on the street. It was getting dark, and he could see the fire starting in the camp across the tracks. Tomorrow he would begin his job as a railroad worker. He was actually looking forward to the hard physical labor. He knew if all went well, he wouldn't be spending too much time at that job anyway. His real job here was going well. In his first day, he had established a connection with a new potential customer and was well on his way to completing his mission. Over in front of the trading post, Leroy McMillan and George Henderson were talking to anyone who would listen. They were laying out their agenda for the newly formed Board of Governors. They were both filled with political ambition. They were both in favor of the railroad, the military assistance, and the emerging New World Order that seemed inevitable. Lieutenant Saunders got up and closed his window to drown out the voices of McMillan and Henderson. Upstairs in the boardroom, Major Stillman stood in the window, listening to every word. When he glanced over toward the warehouse, he saw Carl Fairley looking up at him. He gave a quick wave and returned to his seat at the table. Carl, already on his horse, meandered out of town and up toward the hills, toward home. Thanks for listening. Like and subscribe. Appreciate it. Appreciate all my viewers, all my subscribers. Thank you all again. God bless you.